We're going to end this lecture by talking about kind of the rise of states and how states are really this natural outgrowth uh, of agriculture and increasing population density. So um, when we talk about the rise of states, we have to first understand what we mean by a few of these terms. Okay, polities are political entities, and so in the in cultural anthropology as well as in archaeology, we refer to some specific styles or forms of or specific polities. So we see specifically four types. We have bands, which are characteristic of foraging populations. These have fluid movement, both physically and status wise. You can belong to bands for a variety of different reasons, including kinship, but also including marriage or even friendship. And these bands are what we call fission fusion, meaning there might be times that you come together in larger groups, but you can also break apart into smaller ones. So you've got fluidity based on kind of resource availability, season, etc. There's also a lot of also status mobility. Bands are focused on what we call achieved status, not oh gosh, I'm spacing on the term. Achieved status is something that's not hereditary. Okay. Ascribed is the other word, achieved versus ascribed. So, in hunter gatherer groups and foraging populations, your status is going to depend upon things like how good you are at producing food, whether it's hunting or gathering, how many children you have, how charismatic you are, your wit and banter and stuff. So, there are a lot of ways and a lot of flexibility or movement in status because of that. The second polity type is called a tribe. This is what we see among horticulturalists and to some degree some pastoralist populations. Tribes we often see associated with villages, and within a village there will be a person who has higher status. However, among tribes, the villages are not ranked. So every village is its own polity, and um, you don't see like a central village where the elite live. Okay, so you get some stratification, but most of your status is still based on what you achieve or your own personal characteristics. Once agriculture comes into play, we transition to chiefdoms and states. And so both chiefdoms and states have permanent political structure. Okay. A chiefdom has permanent political structure, hereditary leaders, and social ranking. So the the kind of hallmark characteristic, or what tells archaeologists that we've transitioned to what we call ranked societies, of which chiefdoms and states are both, um, is the burial of children with massive amounts of wealth. Okay, because it is within a chiefdom where you start to base your status on ascribed status or something you were born into. So, um, no 3-year-old has amassed large enough amounts of wealth that they're going to be able to be buried with gold, right? What can 3-year-olds do? They can scribble, they can um, play with toys. They've mastered a lot of language, but they don't have a lot of that understanding of like complex abstract thoughts. So the wealth that you see buried with children is a function of who they were born to, is a function of kind of the hierarchy they were born into. In chiefdoms, that is a continuous hierarchy. Okay, you've got a continuum of social status based on how closely related you are to the chief. Okay, so if the chief has a son, because whenever we see, unfortunately, whenever we see ranked societies, they are always patriarchies. They're not full-fledged patriarchies, but patriarchal, let's say. In these rank societies, it's always males who have more power than females. And so if the chief has a son, then that son is going to inherit his rank, right? And that son would then be buried with grave goods indicative of that high rank. So that's our archaeological marker. So in chiefdoms, that social status is a continuum based on how closely related you are to the chief. So if the chief dies and he doesn't have a descendant, then it might go to his brother, etc. Everyone in the population, however, is considered related to the chief. And so you don't have this distinct hierarchy of high status, low status, middle class kind of thing. Instead, you just have a continuum that goes from highest rank of a chief, who's often even viewed as deific, or some special status with the gods, all the way down to the person who is the most distantly related individual in the entire population. States, by contrast, these are polities that have formal central governments, permanent political structure, but not hereditary leaders. Well, sometimes hereditary leaders. They're not specifically hereditary leaders. But what we see as the hallmark of state level societies is marked, distinct social stratification. That instead of kinship being the means or medium in which we track relatedness and importance and power, it instead becomes arbitrary class distinctions. And so this can be something like the caste system in India, or this can be something like economic wealth or status in some place like the United States. The first states formed in Mesopotamia by about 5,500 years before present. They did not form in Mesoamerica until about 3,000 years later. And that's because it took so long to fully domesticate teosinte into maize. And so you don't have the massive population growth and resulting kind of competition over land and stuff emerge until about 3,000 to or 2,500 years before present. So the complexity and division of social and economic labor grows as food production spreads and intensifies. And so a lot of the reasons given for state formation center around having to manage or regulate problems. So that can be problems like what do we plant? That can be problems like who do we define as citizen versus not citizen? That can be problems like how do we get water to move from the river to our crops when somebody who doesn't like us lives in between, right? So there are a number of regulatory problems that can come up, the regulation of goods, resources, people. But and so increasing political authority comes out of trying to manage or handle those regulatory problems. In the archaeological record, there are no more chiefdoms. Okay, every society today on the planet is part of a larger nation state. And so even though we still have foraging populations like the Kung in South Africa, or like the Ache in Paraguay, right? These populations are not independent of the nation in which they exist. So the Ache, for example, can't exist or engage in behaviors that violate national laws in Paraguay or something like that. So, that even if there are foraging populations that hold on to or are trying to maintain their traditional lifestyle, they have to do so under the umbrella of whatever formal government controls the landmass in which they live, right? So no, there are no more chiefdoms at all, and bands and tribes that are present occur in the context of greater kind of national or international law. So these are entities then that we know from the archaeological record. Primary states were those that formed on their own through competition among chiefdoms, and so constantly trying to like get one up on your neighbor sort of thing. This competition leads to what we call primary state formation. Secondary states are those that arise through spread and conquest. And so, like, as empires spread, like the spread of the Roman Empire, for example, right? That happens through conquest and obtaining territory from competitors, right? That's takeover and then incorporating other people into your social hierarchy. So, we're going to talk about three competing theories of state formation. And I want to preface this by telling you that each of these theories is correct at least part of the time. And each of these theories has problems in that it cannot universally explain state formation. So there is a term in like mathematics, particularly as we're talking about mathematical modeling, where we talk about variables being necessary and or sufficient. Okay, and so a sufficient variable would be one that once it's present, the outcome happens. A necessary variable is a variable where the outcome cannot happen unless that variable is present. So, what's the difference between those? Well, um, a sufficient variable would, or a sufficient explanation or cause of state formation means that once that variable is present, if the population um, has that cause present, they will automatically transition into a state. Okay, whereas these necessary variables, oh, I am confused. All right, I'm going to edit that out. All right, so now we're going to talk about these three competing theories of state formation. And we talk about these in a sense that's sometimes used in like mathematical modeling of behaviors, a sense of being either necessary or sufficient. So when we talk about variables that lead to state formation, if we define a variable as necessary, then that means that states cannot form without that variable. If we define a variable as sufficient, that means that as soon as that variable is present, regardless of everything else, that you will have state formation. And so when we look at these three competing theories of state formation, I want to just preface it with the knowledge that none of these three theories are either necessary or sufficient. Okay, so none of these explain all cases of state formation, and there are either archaeologically or even in modern extant societies examples where these theories may hold true, but the population still has not developed state level political organization. So the first theory is called the hydraulic theory. And it states that one factor in state formation has been the need to regulate hydraulic systems or irrigation in societies that have agricultural economies. When we need to control water, that or controlling water does absolutely increase production. That is, you can grow more crops when you have control over the water and can reliably irrigate. But it also brings with it labor demands and organizational demands. And so the premise here basically is that um, large hydraulics works then sustain these cities or towns and become essential to their subsistence in terms of being able to grow enough crops to feed their people. So it is the growth and kind of control of these large scale hydraulic systems that predicates or precipitates state formation. Um, now, this is not, again, it's not necessary nor sufficient, meaning that there are some states that have emerged without any sort of large scale hydraulic system. Similarly, there were chiefdoms that developed large irrigation systems that did not become states. So, we often think of the Roman aqueducts, but here we've got some other examples. This is Shustar with a very sophisticated system of basically canals and aqueduct type channels to move water around, sustaining a really large agricultural base. And then in Nazca, Peru, this shows an underwater aquifer that was around 30 feet or more underwater. So even without modern technology, people were able to tap into you're able to find and then tap into underground water sources. So hydraulics certainly can help, but they're not necessary for state formation. The second theory states that regional trade networks are responsible for state formation. That is, that states will emerge at strategic locations in regional trade networks, like the crossroads of caravan routes or in mountain passes or river narrows. And I don't know if any of you are Game of Thrones fans, but it seems anymore like people are at least aware of Game of Thrones because of it being adapted into the HBO um, TV series, right? Think about the where the Red Wedding took place. All right, the Red Wedding took place at this it, area called the Narrows, where the land around it, and it's more developed in the book than it is in the TV series. The land around it happens to be swampland. And the Narrows is the easiest point at which kind of this marshland and this river can be crossed. And strategically, you put a city or a keep there, and you are able to competitively exclude people from accessing that without assessing some kind of like toll or tax, right? In the books, eh, they do try to move around this narrows in, and they encounter the swamp people. And the swamp people end up being the ones who like resurrect their dead and worship a different god, and then Caitlin Stark ends up coming back as like zombie Caitlin Stark in the book series, which was never talked about in the TV series. But anyway, the premise is still there, right? If there's something you can competitively control and keep others from moving through that area, then we often see cities or states emerge at those points. And so it can be true, absolutely. But we have areas, crossroads, that have never seen states emerge to control them. We also have states that have emerged without developing long distance trade networks. So trade can come before states, or states might come um, with no trade. So this long distance trade aspect is neither necessary nor sufficient. These trade networks can, in fact, come way after states have already formed. The third theory of state formation that we're going to talk about is referred to as Carniero's multivariate theory. So this is his name right here. And this states that wherever you have either environmental or circumscription or resource concentration, plus an increasing population, plus warfare, you will get states. This environmental circumscription can be either physical or social. So we would think of physically circumscribed environments as things like islands, right? What surrounds an island? Well, a large body of water. It could be river plains, the area that's bordered by like cliffs on each side. It could be oases in the middle of the desert. This is certainly true across the Sahara. It can be valleys in mountain ranges, right? So these can be environmental features that prevent the growth or spread of the population outside of those boundaries. So we'll think about Albuquerque here. Albuquerque has one side on which it is environmentally circumscribed through physical means, and that is our east side, right? We can't expand to the east because we've got the Sandias. We can't really get past those mountains, right? We can also have social circumscription. This is where neighboring societies block expansion, emigration, or access to resources. And so this is absolutely true with Albuquerque as well. Why don't we expand the city to the north? Well, to the north, we have Sandia Pueblo. Why don't we expand the city to the west? Well, to the west, we have Laguna Pueblo. Why don't we expand the city to the south? Well, to the south, we have Isleta Pueblo, right? So the Pueblo land that borders our city on three sides serves as a form of social circumscription, right? It's our neighboring populations and their claims to their land that prevent us from spreading in those directions. So coastal Peru is a really good example of this. Okay, coastal Peru, much of it is desert, and um, then the natural water source. I mean, you can't use the ocean to irrigate your crops, right? So agriculture was limited then to isolated valleys that had freshwater springs. Now, the whole valley and spring system in Peru is also really interesting. There's a group of people called Atahuascans um, who have lived in that area for uh, arguably like thousands of years. That it turns out many of the springs in coastal Peru have really high levels of arsenic. And there's been an interesting genetic adaptation among the Atahuascans that allows them to not develop toxic reactions to high levels of arsenic. So their body has basically been able to develop a system whereby it doesn't poison them slowly, but instead they're able to like metabolize it and flush it out of their system. So if you ever travel to coastal Peru, take bottled water with you. Don't drink the local water, even if the locals are drinking the local water. You know, many areas where you go, um, if you see the locals drinking the water, that generally indicates that it's probably safe for you to drink the water as well. That was kind of the situation that I faced when we were in Indonesia. But coastal Peru was a big exception to that. So, just kind of an interesting little tidbit there. So, these each of these valleys develop their own sort of kind of let's say chiefdom. Um, because they, were able to grow a large enough population base, they were able to develop a series of villages in those valleys, but they couldn't really move beyond those valleys because there was absolute desert kind of beyond the perimeter of the valleys. So it was that physical or environmental circumscription that kept them from expanding. Well, eventually land becomes scarce, rivalries grow, and raiding began. And then one chiefdom conquered another and became an empire. So we define empires as a mature state that is large, multi ethnic, militaristic, and expansive. And so, effectively, given enough time, you end up with one empire that controls basically all of coastal Peru as it conquered its neighbors and uh, kind of incorporated its population base, um, giving it a little more kind of military might. So when we look at Carniero's multivariate theory, it's certainly powerful. It certainly does explain these cases like coastal Peru, but there are also exceptions to it. And that's where Papua New Guinea comes into play. Papua New Guinea, the highlands of Papua New Guinea are have incredibly high population density. So Papua New Guinea is kind of like off, half of it shares one of the Indonesian islands. And so it's there as we're starting to move from Indonesia into Micronesia and Melanesia, the Oceania kind of area of the world. And so, kind of at one side of what eventually spreads across the Pacific and becomes like Polynesia and such. A lot of the origins of Polynesian societies come from Micronesia, Melanesia, Oceania area. So, Papua New Guinea, the coastal areas developed just normal kind of primary state formation and then became interesting to Europe as colonies. But in the highlands, people don't go in the highlands. We're going to watch a documentary about horticulturalists in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. in a couple weeks, and you're going to see why. It is an area that has a lot of interethnic, intertribal warfare and raiding, and that was bad enough when their predominant um, technology or weapon was the blowgun. But as firearms have become more readily available, that intervillage, interethnic raiding has led to murder. I mean, there's no other way to put that, right? They've had an uptick in deaths. And so the Papua New Guinean government is trying to kind of control or get things under control in the highlands. And you'll see footage in that film of something called a sing sing, which is a way to kind of air your grievances and get reparations for someone who's been murdered. Um, anyway, that it's just a little bit of background information there. So the reason the intervillage rating is so high and the interethnic conflict is so high is because the population density is so high. But each of these communities has this defensible area where they're able to keep people out. So there's one that has this mountain pass and they mummify their ancestors. There are others that are coastal with like crocodile, not quite coastal, more rivers, aquatic. Um, with like massive crocodile populations that are like physically not safe to cross and such. And so Highland Papua New Guinea has environmental circumscription. It has warfare. It has really dense populations. But these have never led to state formation. And arguably, even though technically the country of Papua New Guinea owns or controls these highland areas, in many cases, government officials are not even willing to travel to these highlands. So they effectively operate as their own independent, we call them tribes, but, and I guess it's hard to define. I mean, warfare like, we can have tribes that have higher levels of intervillage warfare. So a tribal organization is probably the best descriptive term for what is present in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. So archaeologically, V. Gordon Child coined the phrase the Neolithic Revolution for the origins and impact of food production. He also coined the phrase the urban revolution for the period of time in which cities and states emerged, specifically highlighting 10 key attributes of these institutions. Child worked with Mesopotamia and Egypt. So many of these defining features are definitely an old world kind of attitude, and don't necessarily fit the bill in every case as we look at the emergence of New World states. So his defining features include cities that are larger, more extensive, and more densely populated than previous settlements. So we're talking about populations in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, versus, well, villages are generally capped at about 200 individuals when we look at small villages. Beyond that, the only way villages are able to grow larger is if they are a subset of like a chiefdom or a state. When villages operate as like the smallest unit or an independent unit, uh, their um, their size tends to cap out at about 200. Within cities, there are full time specialists, craftsmen, transport workers, merchants, officials, and priests. We call this economic, I'm losing words today, occupational, occupational, not differentiation, specialization. That's what it is. We call it occupational specialization. Thank you guys for being patient with me. And so that means that for the first time, really, in human prehistory slash history, individuals are not always involved with the production of food. At every other point in human prehistory, even if you were a village leader, you still had to cultivate your own crops. You still had everyone has to hunt. Everyone has to gather, right? Families were not fed on the work of others. That's not to say food sharing wasn't widespread, because in foraging populations, food sharing is widespread. It's just that everyone had some sort of role to play in economic production when we're talking about the economics of food. Okay? In cities, we have occupational specialization and the removal of people from playing a role in food production. And so these full-time specialists, craftsmen, etc., even the elite or the leaders, get their food from the effort or work of commoners or peasants. Okay, so the overproduction by people who are employed in the agricultural realm subsidizes these groups of um, specialized occupations. And so that ties into number three, that primary producers, those involved in food production, have to pay some sort of tithe or tax that then is stored in a central place, such as a temple or a treasury. So that tithe or tax early on is in the form of food, right? Farmers would give a portion of their crops to the central treasury. You would have some sort of system or construction of like warehouses where you would store that grain. Um, in modern times, of course, that tithe or tax is paid in currency. And so once populations innovate currency, generally linked to some sort of precious metal, then those populations will change kind of acceptable methods of paying a tithe or a tax. There were also uh, cross culturally situations that would arise where the only tithe or tax that people could afford to pay were their own offspring. And they'd be sent to monasteries, convents, you know, other kinds of contexts where they'd be fostered out to uh, to people higher up in the social hierarchy. Monumental buildings. We call this monumental architecture. This distinguishes cities from villages and symbolizes the right of rulers. So, a very obvious example of monumental architecture are the pyramids in Egypt, right? Super visible, super large, only accomplished through um, the labor of a huge amount of people. Took a lot of time, took a lot of expendable wealth, right? But we're not just talking about uh, things like the pyramids. In many cases, we are, even in the New World, right? When we think about Mayan ruins and Incan ruins, we tend to have this what we call a step pyramid that is some kind of central fixture in the community. But there are also some populations like the Olmec of central Mexico who carve giant heads. Now, we're not talking about Easter Island heads, we're talking about heads that were more circular. Um, but again, any sort of, and these heads would have been like 20, 30 feet tall. Any sort of monument symbolizes extravagance, symbolizes some kind of wealth. We talk in archaeological anthropology about populations that quote unquote entertain in a chiefly manner. And that's really, I mean, that's some jargon there, right? Like, what does that mean to you? Well, it basically means that they exhibited some kind of um, demonstrations of excess. So this might be like they threw big banquets, or they lavished gifts upon people who came to visit them, or they built these massive architectural features that do nothing except show that they're wealthy. We could argue that houses and cars kind of serve that function in modern populations, right? Particularly when you buy a house that's larger than you need, or you buy a car that's got more horsepower than you need, and uses a lot of gas, right? What are we really signaling? Well, we're signaling that we've got disposable wealth. We're signaling that we have enough money that we can not only meet our basic needs, but also meet our wants and desires. And that is a form of kind of signaling for competition, right? Number five, a ruling class that was supported by the treasury. So the elites don't do work. That's not to say that governing is not work, but really, when you get down to it, the elites don't do a whole lot of work. Um, Writing is used as a form of record keeping, and so we see this first in the in Mesopotamia through the development of something called cuneiform. Cuneiform also spread to the Indus River Valley. All early writing is some form of pictograph language. So, of course, in Egypt we call that hieroglyphs, but there are a very wide variety of other pictograph-based writing systems across the world. I mean, we can just look at the Aztec, the Maya, or the Inca for New World representations of a pictograph form of writing. The earliest written records basically track who paid their taxes and who didn't. So, it's still a bit of time before we develop written like prose and poetry and use writing as a form of artistic expression. But, that does come eventually. Number seven, scientific advances that include arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. These happen for two reasons. One, because we need to be able to measure the wealth we have, right? We also need to be able to navigate on these long distance trade routes. So, science and math developing for functional reasons um, is one of those quote unquote reasons why these things develop. The other is that we've got an elite ruling class that doesn't do any work. So we've got a situation for the first time in human history where there are people who have access to food, access to wealth, but nothing to do. Some of these people are those that pursue science, math, etc. It's also a place to send your excess offspring, your sons that aren't going to inherit, right? You send them to fight in the military, you send them to the university, they become like the Galileos and such. Number eight, sophisticated art styles developed also because people have free time and the elites aren't working, right? So art becomes a way to pass the time. Art becomes a way to display your wealth. Um, Art becomes kind of something that you send your kids to do to keep them from basically having illegitimate offspring, right? Number nine, there's long distance trade and foreign trade. That one's pretty self explanatory. And then number 10, society was reorganized on the basis of territorial divisions rather than kinship groups. This is critical for that transition from chiefdom to state. And so what happens is the new rulers uh, develop arbitrary social hierarchies and social classes specifically to interrupt people's kinship ties. So that instead of having some continuum of social status, you've got distinct strata, never the which shall meet or interact. And so, in some cases, this even translates into an ethnicity designation. Um, so, with kind of institutionalized, structural racism and prejudice. So, breaking apart these kinship ties basically create infighting between people within a stratum so that they won't rise up and overtake the government, right? That's one of the best ways to keep a revolution from happening is to keep the people that you oppress fighting with one another over basically made up differences. So, an example is we've got the term Hispanic as part of ethnicity in in New Mexico and in the US in general, like on the census and stuff. But one of the best ways to keep Hispanics out of power is to fuel the discrimination and it's not quite racism because we're not talking about a race, but the conflict between Hispanics of different cultural origins. So pit the Cubans and Puerto Ricans against the Mexicans and the Spanish, for example. All right, so that is why states emerge. The very last topic of discussion is why states collapse. We have seen that the emergence of states is multifactorial, that there is no one reason why states form. We also would say the same thing about state collapse, that there is not one universal reason why states collapse. There are instead various factors, including invasion, disease. Famine is a really big one. Prolonged drought, we're familiar with this in the desert Southwest, right? Like, why was Chaco Canyon eventually abandoned? And then environmental degradation. And so we're going to look specifically at the Maya decline to talk about why things collapse. The classic Maya civilization flourished between about 300 and 900 years in the current era across Mexico, the Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Belize. And there's a lot of very visible, let's say, Maya material remains, right? Wasn't it 2012? We were all supposed to die because the Mayan calendar only went that far. So they were known for monuments, calendars, mathematics, and hieroglyphic writings. Um, and so, as recently as like towards the end of their decline, so approaching in like I think it was 850 or 880 years in the current era, they were fashioning a new royal building at Colpan that never was finished. And so there were environmental factors that were behind this decline of this royal center. That included deforestation. They basically were running out of places to clear for agricultural land. There was erosion, and there was this thing called soil exhaustion. So one factor that I didn't mention earlier on when it comes to agricultural fields is that when you practice agriculture in mountainous areas, you often have to terrace your agricultural fields. So if you've ever traveled to Europe and gone through places like the Alps, you will see the terraces where it's like the hillside looks like stair steps. The same is true in Central and South America. And so that terracing, what it does is it prevents your crops from washing down the mountain when the rain falls. But because they're terraced mountainsides, minerals do run down. And so what ends up happening is salts build up, mineral salts build up in your soil, and you effectively neutralize the soil to the point that nothing organic can really grow. And so that's what we mean by soil exhaustion. That we've taken all of the nutrients out of the soil and we don't really have a way of replenishing those nutrients. Flood-based agriculture replenishes a lot of nutrients because it's river material, it's river water that's coming and depositing in the fields. And what's present in rivers? Well, fish and other things, protozoans, bacteria, etc. And so all of that organic material is reintroduced to the soil when you irrigate that way. But when you've got mountainsides that you're um, cultivating, then you've got this problem of mineral buildup. So, from the period just before the Maya civilization collapsed, we also see evidence of increased concern with fortification. So, this points to the fact that not only were there these environmental factors that were making it harder for the Maya to kind of meet the demands of their population, but there was also potential conflict um, and a concern with kind of this military aspect of large scale states. So, in summary, know what I mean by the terms of Mesolithic and Neolithic, right? Consider how the changes in human subsistence techniques arose at different times in different world regions. Know the significance of plant domestication and the distinct environmental zones in the Middle East and Mesopotamia. So, be able to identify, for example, the importance of this vertical economy with the alluvial floodplain, the hilly flanks, the Piedmont steppe, and the high plateau. Know the genetic changes that take place in plants and animals as we domesticate them, right? This is the loss of natural seed dispersal mechanisms and larger seeds and more yield. This is also in animals, of course, the loss of these defense like horns and such, these mechanisms of defense, which then creates the need for human help in their uh, in defending them. They rely on us for their defense. Know the 7 world regions where domestication independently occurred. Be able to identify the main differences in farming in the old and new worlds, particularly that loss of or that lack of large domesticable animals in the new world, and be able to identify some of the species involved and where they were domesticated. Be familiar with why the Neolithic economy can emerge more rapidly in some areas versus others. Consider how food production contributes to uh, the socio-political organization of the state, how they just kind of naturally extend from one to the other. Know how anthropologists define the state, the factors that have contributed to the emergence, and the relationship of food production to state formation. Be able to identify these key attributes of states. This is specifically that urban revolution term from V. Gordon Child, and then know how scholars explain the collapse of states, because once we transition into state level socio-political systems, like that continuity that we saw from 5 million years ago to 10,000 years ago, right? That these populations that are relatively unchanged, that's not true of state formation. States may persist for quite some time, but that scale of quite some time is a lot less time than what we were talking about in prehistory.